everyone. Welcome to your workshop. How are we doing this fine evening? Glad to have you here, Brooklyn and Janaya. Janai? I think Janai. Let me know if I said that correctly. But hello, welcome, Nikki and Miracle. Nice to have you all here. Hey, Zoe. Welcome. All right, so I'm pretty excited to be hanging out with you all today because it's not just a class where we talk about the theory of MCAT studying and what we do and timelines and all that. We will do that too. But a lot of what we do today is actually just crank through some passages and problems. And so we will do a bunch of the science, the background content required. We'll also talk about some of the major themes of the MCAT in general, which I'll just say this right now. What's the most important thing to have in your tool belt going into the MCAT? What is your most important skill? Your most important thing to focus on? Most important thing to think about, maybe? What are they testing on this exam? It's a very open-ended question. Miracle, that's exactly it. Honestly, it's a critical thinking test. And so the thing is we like to think that the MCAT is a science exam. And it's true, there is a ton of science on this test. And to get a great score, especially 520 plus, you need to know your science. But what they're mostly testing is how you can, as Rod is saying there, apply your understanding or your background knowledge to novel situations or different examples and passages and that kind of stuff. And so because of that, there's actually a bunch of different ways you can solve problems that aren't necessarily the normal way through using critical thinking and your background content to find your way to a right answer without necessarily doing all of the work. And so what I'll try to do today is to go through those other ways you can think about problems. And what I actually encourage you all to do when you're doing your own practice is to solve things multiple ways. Sure, do all the work, write out the math, make sure you can solve it the traditional way, but also see if you can figure out some other kind of way to solve problems through using critical thinking and kind of novel approaches. And we'll try to look at things from multiple angles, because really when it comes to super high scores in the MCAT, the 520 plus, it's not just knowing your stuff, it's being able to approach problems from multiple directions. So no matter whether the problem is within your wheelhouse or outside your wheelhouse, you've got a really good chance of getting it right regardless. And so that'll be kind of the focus for today. Cool. So I'm also super glad to be joined by Nick and Mike today as well. And so if you have not been in Zoom webinar before, we've got a QA. So any questions that you have specific to what's going on with you, we'll talk about calendars and planning and all that, hit us up in the QA. I'm going to keep using this chat that you've all been using this entire time. Because this is not meant to be just a lecture where you sit back and listen and watch. Instead, I'm going to just try to ask you questions the whole time to basically lead you on this journey. And then depending how people answer, we'll change the course of the class. That's kind of how all these classes work. So yeah, let's jump in. And so we'll talk a lot about the MCAT. Oh, nice. Also, yeah, as Nick says, we have a little 20K scholarship going on right now. We'll bring this up once again, but thanks for putting that link in the chat directly, Nick. Appreciate it. We'll see that in a slide in the future as well. Structure for today, we're going to go through a couple of things. We're going to start with timeline. We're going to talk about study plan, but honestly, the biggest bulk of this class is going to be working through problems and doing approach and talking about science, that kind of stuff. We actually have an example passage to work through, as well as several example problems, kind of, examples within biochem, and then some mathy stuff too. Should be pretty fun. And then we'll end with studying effectively, what you need to do, calendar building, resources, all that kind of stuff. We'll make it into the theory of what you need to do to succeed. And so actually, I want to get a sense of the room. When are you planning on taking the MCAT? Let's put that out there to the room. Is it this January, maybe this March, maybe some point in the future? Not really sure. Looks like we have a lot of folks testing in the relatively nearish future, January, March. Looks like mostly 2024 though. Yeah, if you're a freshman here, don't worry about it at all. You got some time. So cool thing is though, I have this argument for years, is that I feel I want people to study for the MCAT before they actually study all their normal coursework, because when people study for the MCAT, they're forced to look at things from a slightly different angle. And one of the coolest things about the MCAT, and you can work this into the way that you build your study plan and be effective with your studying, is that it's completely different from the way that people test things in college courses. Because you take a class on physics and the problems are exclusively physics. You take a class on Gen Chem, it's exclusively Gen Chem. The MCAT does not do that. The MCAT smooshes everything together. And so what we really want you to do as you're going through this process is to start to build those bridges, to connect those dots, to think about how the different topics relate to each other, because that's what you see on the MCAT as well. And we'll show you an image of the breakdown of the content on the MCAT to kind of really make sense of that. We'll get there momentarily. We'll kind of tie that into how you can work it into, if you are studying courses right now, how you can kind of keep MCAT prep in mind as you're working through your classes and really kind of get the big picture, main point. Okay, so yeah, we've got lots of stuff to talk about, but this is also meant to be an open conversation. So if there are other things you want to bring up, we're always down to talk about stuff. And so we'll kind of like we'll see where this journey takes us. And so we'll start by just talking about time in general. So about how many hours does it take to prep for the MCAT? About. This is now assuming that you have the background content, like assuming you've taken the full coursework and you have your prereqs done. In that context, about how many hours? Nice pick. That is pretty darn spot on. Yeah, it's like between 300 and 400 is what most people say. I think AMC technically says it's like 240 might be their specific number. But that's assuming that you have recently taken all of the prereqs, that you feel relatively comfortable enough to have like passed your midterms and exams and all that. But like most people, like, has anyone prepping now, but like it's been maybe several years since you had Gen Chem, or several years since you had Intro Bio? Has like been a little while since you've done this? Like, which is most people. And so like that's the thing with like this kind of, students report an average of 20 hours a week for 3 months to prepare for the exam, which is technically 240 hours. But honestly, like, it usually takes people more than that. And if you are coming in where it's been a little while, or maybe you haven't studied all the classes yet, we actually have a decent amount of people who prep for the MCAT who haven't studied biochemistry yet. You can totally do fine on the MCAT without studying biochemistry in courses, but it means you're going to have extra work to do on top of those 240 hours to make sure you know a couple like key aspects of biochemistry. So speaking of biochemistry, what's an example of something that you just need to have memorized? Amino acids, right? Everyone says that. It's so McCall's men, you don't need to memorize the equation necessarily, but you do need to understand it. Things like Km, Vmax, what that means, how they relate to things like affinity versus, enzyme, like speed, you can call it. But yeah, like your amino acid codes, like the 1-letter codes, the 3-letter codes, what the amino acids look like the idea is like in biochemistry classes, they're gonna basically quiz you on that stuff. On the MCAT, you're not going to get a problem that says what kind of amino acid is tryptophan. Instead, they expect you to know your amino acids, what they behave like, what they look like, what kind of charges or polar, non-polar situations they got going on. And then you'll use that background as the language in which the test is written. And so like that's the thing to keep in mind, is like this is not a test saying like what's this amino acid. It's like, but if you don't know it, you're not going to understand what the question's asking you. And so this is a critical thinking exam that is written in the language of science. And when you see words that are science words and you don't know what they mean, you're not going to understand the language enough to actually excel on this exam. And so as Aiden's saying there as well, like enzymes, like, so for example, if I said a kinase, they're not going to tell you what a kinase does. You need to know it. So what does a kinase do, as an example? Kind of like this is the background language that's required for the MCAT. Kinases are enzymes that, nice, they are a transferase. They phosphorylate stuff. You got it. So they phosphorylate stuff. Perfect. So it's specifically a transferase. So it means it moves a phosphate group from one thing to another thing, but it is phosphorylation totally. So that's kind of just a couple ideas. Is like the language is really important. And if you like, especially if you're like freshman, sophomore, you haven't studied this stuff yet, it's going to be real hard to prep for the MCAT. But one of the cool things is that one of the like the things that are most important for this exam is really the fundamentals, like the Gen Chem 1 stuff, periodic trends, units within physics, like word roots, right? So like the different names of enzymes, as well as just different like anatomical like word roots. Like, so for example, if I were to say something like endo, what's endo mean? Like an example would be like an endonuclease. Inside, totally. Or something like hep. Like if I said hep, like hepatitis is an example. Hep means liver, right? Or if I say like, what would be example, like afferent, like AFF, afferent, like an afferent neuron or an afferent arteriole. Afferent means, in the context of neurons, it would mean sensory, right? It means it's entering totally true. So it could be an artery that's entering a system, or it could be something that's entering the brain. Like, so an afferent neuron would mean sensory, right? Efferent would mean exit. So a lot of it is like these word roots. And if you realize you don't know the various like science word roots, that would be your first step for those of you that are relatively fresh and coming into this, as well as like big picture stuff, like just the units within physics, or like why the periodic table makes sense, why it's cool, what kind of behavior elements have. That stuff is huge. Yeah, like word roots are, you're going to see every MCAT teacher ever is going to rant about word roots for a long time. Not necessarily, Ben. You'll just kind of see them throughout all the sciences. I don't, unless the other teachers know of like a bank for like word roots. But you can't really get away from them. What I would say is anytime you learn a new sciencey word, just break down the etymology. Be like, okay, well, what does this mean? Why does it mean it? Because almost entirely in medicine, all that you're really doing is giving the Latin word for something very explicitly. So like, for example, like, did anyone know you actually call the hole that's at the bottom of people's skulls, like where your spine goes into your skull? This is a good example. It's called foramen. One other word, magnum, perfect. Which translates to what? Just big hole, totally. Like that's the thing, or great hole. You got it. And so like the thing is like almost always in all of medicine and science, the words are just a Latin word for like a very straightforward thing. And so like that'd be like one example. There's tons of them. You're going to see them all the time. Just like we said, hepatitis, right? That just means like inflammation of the liver, right? It's not like some brand new word to memorize, but if you know itis means inflammation, you know hep means the liver, you can figure it out. Hence inflammation of the liver. Okay, so yeah, well, I'll stop talking about that. But that's like, we got some folks who are new to the game, want to bring up some big ideas like that. Word roots are huge. Know your Latin. You don't need to memorize Latin by any means, but like it's going to help a lot in med school and the MCAT. In terms of timelines, so this is if you have all your background content, then it usually takes people at 240 hours. And so the thing is, notice that 240 hours, I am honestly wary that it says this. Do you know why I'm actually not a big fan of how much time I should spend studying? I think this word is problematic. Why is studying problematic? Like, what are you really doing? It's too passive, right, Emily? Perfect. What do we need to do? Nice. It's application, as Kristen's saying, right? We need to practice, right? It's about the quality, right? And so the idea is like the time that you're putting into this exam, you want to make sure that I would say like, unless you're like haven't had the content or it's been a long time, then yeah, you need to study stuff. If you haven't had Gen Chem in 4 years, you're going to be spending a bunch of time studying Gen Chem. But what's really important, as Diane's saying, is that if you want to actually get good at this exam, if you want to get one of the top scores, you are not going to be studying for this exam as much as you are going to be practicing for this exam. And as soon as you study something, if you are back on your content, you got to catch back up, right? As soon as you study something, immediately afterwards do problems on it. Then a week later, do more problems on that same thing. And this is a thing that we kind of work this into our courses. And I'll talk a lot about the Kaplan course structures and how it like takes the work out of it for you. So just like tells you what to do. But the idea is we call it spaced learning. When you get exposed to a thing, you are far less likely to remember it unless you practice it afterwards. And if you practice it again within, like 72 up to like a week or so afterwards, it's way more likely to stick than if you just practice it once immediately afterwards, then don't see it again for weeks at a time. And so this course is kind of built around a way to like kind of maximize the time you put in to help with retention. You can also do this totally on your own, but like the problem that most people do when they prep for the MCAT on their own is they spend a whole bunch of time studying and waiting until they feel confident on a thing, but don't actually retain it because they're not practicing enough. And so that's like, if there's a single thing to take out of this, no matter what, you got to be practicing for this exam, like doing practice problems. And we'll talk a lot about the problems that are available, like where you get them, how you get them, things like that as well. But always we get to the resources section. And it's not all Kaplan stuff either by any means, but like you need to be doing practice problems. Okay, so then if you kind of think of it this way, we recommend 300. Any guess why we recommend 300 hours, not 240, even though the average student spends 240 hours preparing for the MCAT? Why would we say that's not enough? You need to do even more. It's true right out for sure, practice exams, but also if the average student spends 240, right? So average is actually not 508, average is 500. So the way the test is designed is that the perfect mean score should be a 500. Anything over 500 is going to be above average. Anything under 500 is below average. But if you want to get in, you got to be well above average. You got it. And so like 508 plus or so if you're looking at like actually like applying to medical schools with it. And every med school is different. Some are going to accept lower scores, some accept higher scores. But no matter what, like you need to be above average. And so most folks that do well on the MCAT and do matriculate in medical schools definitely spend more than 240 hours. So it's like hard to get that total breakdown, but it's definitely more. What most folks do too, and where it says for 3 months is pretty average. Very rarely will people prep in less than 3 months and be comfortable. Honestly, 400 is not overkill, Sean. Like some people spend more than 500 hours prepping for the MCAT. It really just depends on the individual and your own background, right? So like the thing is like, if you know that you don't know your background content, if you have a ton of work to do, you might spend well more than that. It really does depend on the individual. And that's the thing, Comfort. Yeah, if you got a full-time job, you're going to probably split this out over a longer period of time. I think between 3 and 6 for folks who are basically are busy and have lots of other things going on. If you don't have 20 hours you can put in every week, because I know 20 hours every week is a big commitment. And if you got a full-time job and kids and other stuff going on, like you might max out at 10 or 15. And so that's kind of the idea is like, I would do your math for like 300. One thing though too is like, let's say that you're prepping and you want to test in January, and then come January you're like, I'm not ready yet. Like, what do you want to do? Oh, no, I don't know, Sean. Yeah, I don't know if they've done a full analysis of like that kind of. That's a great question because like these numbers come from the AMC directly, not Kaplan. Our numbers would inherently be biased because anyone that we have numbers for means that they were prepping for the MCAT and taking a course, and so we kind of like screw with the averages that way, you know. So it's like to actually sample the regular population would be tough. The AMC might be curious if there's data out there, but I haven't heard of it if there is. But yeah, as you got it, basically, push it back. Like, so this is another. I'm just gonna kind of throw a lot of the really important things at you in the beginning of this class because like, I want to get the stuff out of the way. Very important idea as well. You do not want to sit for the MCAT and have an official score unless you are confident that score is a score that you're going to be comfortable applying with. Now, some of you might have taken the MCAT before and done badly, and you're like, I need to do this thing again because I have a bad score. It is going to count against you in your applications if you have previous scores, but like the past is past. All you got to do is move forward. And what the way to basically come up from a really bad score in the past is to have a significantly improved score the next time you test. Like the worst thing you can do is take the MCAT time after time and keep getting lower scores and wait to get a higher score. Like med schools do not like the way that looks. Like what they want to see is students who like do a thing when they know they can do a thing, when they fully prepared for a thing. And so like if you can have a single score that is a good score, that is by far the preferred thing for med schools to see. If you do have prior scores, that's fine, but you gotta make sure that if you test again, you have a significant bump, not just a slow creeping up over time. It's so you can take it, I think, 3 times within a given year, Ben, but there's also a lifetime maximum, I believe, of 6 times where they just don't let you take it more than that. Of seven, they use 7 times around it, thank you. But the thing is like even if you take it and you void it, right? If you take the MCAT and then during the test you're like, this isn't going well, I'm going to cancel, that still counts towards the 7. No shows also count towards the 7 for totally. It doesn't count in terms of scores. It's not going to count against you when you apply to med schools, but in terms of your like lifetime max, totally, it does still count. And you could pretend if you reach out to AMC and you like have a sob story, you can tell them like I've heard of people getting around that lifetime cap. Like there's ways, you just got to talk to people. But it is once again not an ideal situation. And yeah, as Mike's saying, if you want to reach out for like the various FAQs about the logistics of that, check out the site. Feel free to reach out to the AMC; they can answer those questions. But my main point for you all is to don't sit for the real thing until you feel confident that your score is going to be pretty good. And how can you feel confident that your score is going to be pretty good? Practice it full length practice exams, right? To take the actual thing in the actual timing at the actual time of day under the exact same conditions as much as possible and get a score on that exam. That's something you'd be comfortable applying to schools with. And so that's really the thing. And not just once, right? But doing it several times to average over a couple of scores that you'd be comfortable applying with. And so like it takes time to do that, like for real. So we'll talk about the total number of exams and all that going forward. I have a bunch of advice on that. But I just want to like at the very beginning of the class get a lot of these big ideas out of the way because I know we got a mix of folks that come to these sessions, and I know a lot of folks are haven't really heard these kind of like big picture things. So I like to start with the big picture. Okay, so we've covered that. We're gonna get into the science pretty soon here too. But we recommend 300 because obviously some people don't study. We want to be above average. Clearly. One more thing about scores that you want. That's fine, Maria. So like honestly, scores before you study, like honestly, anything high 480s is actually that's like way above average for a first score. But I would not stress about what your score is when you begin, because even if you do know your content, doesn't necessarily translate to a good score in the MCAT. The MCAT is tested in a way that is just so different than the way that college coursework's tested that even folks that are super confident on content don't often do great on this test. And so it's not just that you're prepping to get the science down, you're also preparing for the type of thinking that the AMC wants you to do to make sure that you're ready for medical school. Like it's such a, as Ian saying, like for real, like it's just like totally like a different thing compared to what most people are used to. And so yeah, don't worry at all if like, yeah, what your score is now. And yeah, if even taking a year and a half, like great, like the more time, Christian, you have, the better, honestly. Yeah, like one thing that you might do if you are really early in your progress right now is like, let's say last year you did your first gen chem and now you're working on like orgo and taking the more advanced sciences. I would once in a while open up your old like gen chem exams from last year and just go through the problems again. Like a way to stay fresh in that content is just like once every couple months, maybe open up old exams if you still have them from your first year courses and just kind of like review the concepts and make sure you can just still do this stuff. And if you do that, once you get into your actual MCAT, like, getting down to it, like you're going to be in such better shape than most people. And so just like little kind of things you can do. One more thing, actually, this is another relatively non-traditional piece of advice that I love to give students. But one thing that is huge on the MCAT, data interpretation. They love giving you lots of like experiments where you have to interpret graphs, tables, charts, and all that kind of stuff. And so because of that, there's actually another resource out there that's very similar to the MCAT, but it doesn't have all the background content in science that's in the MCAT. It's an exam that's called the ACT. And so freakishly enough, if you look at the science section of the ACT, it looks a whole lot like the MCAT, just there's no science on it. And so what I encourage you to do is if you are one of those people that you're like, man, I hate graphs and tables and charts, I don't feel good with that stuff, you could go to any public library and honestly get a book on the ACT, because like all public libraries usually have them, open it up, go right to the section on science section and go to the practice test, honestly go through it. And so that's like a thing, exactly as Nick is saying, for real, like if you know you need to work on graph interpretation, like check out ACT science section, do some practice quizzes. And if you do well on them, you're fine. If you don't, it means it's something you actually do need to work on. Perfect. Yeah, exactly. There's so much stuff online, Dan, for sure. There's a mix of resources like also Khan Academy. I'm a huge supporter of Sal Khan and Khan Academy in general. I donate money monthly. They're doing good work in the world. They have tons of stuff on there too, for real. And so like there's tons of stuff out there, but like no matter what you're doing in terms of studying, you gotta be practicing. And do you all know what practice is the most essential? Which practice problems you really need to be doing? Well, cars for sure, but like whose cars passages, right? Cars is really important practice. I agree. But the questions that come directly from the AMC Taylor, right? The people who make the actual MCAT. And so like no matter who you are, like even if you're gonna try to like, I'm gonna try to do this thing for free, I'm gonna do all the free stuff I can, like you still need to get AMC resources and those cost money. Through Kaplan courses and many other courses, like you'll get the AMC stuff with the course, but you can buy it on your own, but it's still a lot of money just to get the AMC resources. But like you, for real, like you need to do the AMC practice if you want to make sure that you feel comfortable with the way that this test actually looks. And there's so much AMC practice out there. It all comes with Kaplan courses. But like no matter how you play it, like you got to get those problems. That's fine, Jane. I do other like either Kaplan, of course. There's other companies out there as well. Khan Academy has some sample problems as well. But it's like if it's been a long time, I might still redo those AMC stuff anyways, but you're definitely want to fit in other exams. I'll talk about the Kaplan stuff. We have like 13 other ones on top of the AMC. So there's tons out there. But I might even just retest some of the AMC stuff anyways. At least if it's been long enough. Okay, so we'll come back to that as well. As I said, I want to give you a lot of the big picture stuff right at the beginning here, because like if we're talking about high scores, the name of this class is 520 plus. Like this is the way you do it. It's lots of practice problems. Yeah, and exactly, Dan. We're going to talk about that at the end too. I have an entire system to talk about that. But it's never take an exam unless you're going to review it, and I'll have the whole section at the end of this class where I'm going to really dig into that idea for sure. So one thing actually, since we had a lot of questions on this. When it comes to test dates as well, how soon can you apply to med school? I want to kind of throw this out to everyone too. And we have a host and panels question, but how soon can you apply to med school? Early states, June, totally true. Which means that if you're planning on testing in January and you don't feel ready, you can push back to March. If you're planning in March and don't feel early, you can push back to April. The thing is, as long as you test by the beginning of May, you can theoretically get your application in the very beginning of the cycle. And it's about a month to get your scores back in, and that's totally correct. But I cannot express enough if it is at all possible for you to get your med school applications in the very beginning of the cycle, like the first couple days of the cycle, like in June, do it. It's awesome. Med schools love to see that. They want people who are going to go above and beyond and get their application in at the top of the pile. And it's true. It's like due later, Maya, but it opens in June, and the earlier you apply, the better. Most schools do rolling admissions, and so for real, the earlier you apply, the less people you're competing against. And so yeah, it's like I think if you're not ready in January, push it back. But that's kind of the idea. You can apply while you're waiting for your scores. It's just a little sketchy because you don't want to be sending out a bad score to a whole bunch of schools, and if you don't know what the score is, you might be doing that, Taylor. So like it's doable for sure. But it's better to know the score if you can, but it's doable. Correct. You got it. Yeah, Rod, for sure. Totally. And once again, you can apply much later than June. You can apply through August. But the thing is like, if you're applying to competitive schools and like all that, like it's just the earlier the better. Perfect. Yeah, exactly. That's fine. You can still apply Edison for sure. Just you will, once again, you'll be about a month later, but that's like, you can still do it. That'll be fine, but you won't be in at the very beginning of the cycle. And so for those most competitive Ivy League, really competitive schools, like they'll consider you a late application, even if you're applying in July. I know it sounds crazy, but that's like for real a thing. Cool. But yeah, it's like, but you can do it. Like many schools, many people still get in applying in June and August, of course. But it's just, yeah, the earlier the better. So the actual place where you enter all that stuff, Karen, opens I think in March or April. I bet like Nick and Mike know that. But like the application opens earlier, you just can't submit. But you can start typing in personal statements and stuff long before June. Cool. But yeah. Oh, gotcha. Okay, cool. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna move on. I know we've got a couple other things going in the chat there. In terms of the scores and the applications. I will let the you can, Marie, for sure. Like you can add the score afterwards and all that. But maybe like hit us up in QA for other kind of logisticsy things. I want to get it. We got to get to the science. I want to keep moving, make sure we get to it. So all this little calendar here, Comfort is basically the idea is if you are testing in 12 weeks, if you divide that by 300, that means you need to study about 25 hours a week. Or if you want to think, all right, well, I only have about 20 hours a week I can study, you then basically multiply that number, divide that number by 300 to tell you the number of weeks you have. So basically notice it works in either direction in terms of figuring out like the amount of time that you need. Like it's one thing to keep in mind though, and this is like a classic problem people come into, is like you'd be like, all right, I can on average study 14 hours a week. That's not always going to be true in weeks like holiday seasons and Thanksgiving week, maybe not. Sometimes weeks you'll have more than 14 hours. And so do be aware that like when we do this kind of math, you want to think ahead in terms of what kinds of weeks will I actually have no time and what kinds of weeks will I have additional time, and work that into your calculus as well. Cool. Yeah, for most of them, for sure. There's a couple schools that are a bit unique. One thing, if you want all these questions also answered, because they are different for individual schools, I encourage you to check out the MSAR. That's the Medical School Admissions Requirements. That's for all allopathic medical schools in the US and Canada. That's schools that convert MD degrees. It's different for DO schools. They have their own system, but it effectively gives you, nice, Nick's got the link, all of the specific details about every single medical school down to like in-state versus out-of-state, averages, ranges of scores and GPAs and all that kind of stuff. It's a really good resource. In terms of, I want to give you one piece of advice for applications though. So when you are looking through that, don't apply to a school just because it's in a state that you want to move to, unless you are connected to that school in some way or it's a private school. Like, so the classic example of this is University of Washington in Seattle. A lot of people are like, Seattle's cool, I want to move there, I'll apply to med school there. Turns out though, like unless you live in the state of Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, I believe, like you pretty much have zero chance of getting in. Like, because it's a state-funded medical school and they are legally required to accept a certain number of students from each of those states, because those states pay money to University of Washington to accept their candidates so they know they have doctors coming home. And so there's a lot of very state-specific things, and a lot of public schools do not have the option to let in people they want. Instead, it's required by the state law, a certain number of people based on residency. And so like, don't just apply to places you want to live. You're probably not going to get into most of them. Private schools are a little bit different, and it's different if you have a connection to the state. But exactly, yeah, exactly as Nick's saying, like many schools are created to bring more doctors to that state. And if they don't think that you're going to live in that state, they don't want you there. So just keep in mind, do your research. Don't do blanket applications. It's a waste of money. Every application is going to cost you like $300. And so if people apply to like 20 schools, it gets very, very expensive. And you don't want to be throwing that money away unless it feels fun for some reason. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about that for now, but we'll keep moving. This is the general idea of studying. You can break it down in terms of how you want to do it. But good thing for all of you is even if you plan to test in January or March and you're not feeling ready, you can push it back and still apply in the very beginning of June. Okay, so kind of moving into more MCAT specific stuff. I know a lot of folks have seen this before, especially if you're testing in January, you've probably seen this before. But this is the breakdown of the number of questions and the length of time per MCAT. There is also a 30-minute break in the middle. I'll kind of add this in. So you have a 30-minute break between these two sections. You have a 10-minute break between these two, and you have another 10-minute break in the middle between these two as well. So it is a full day adventure when it comes to taking the MCAT. Endurance is such a big part of this exam, and it's also why it's really important to make sure that you're taking full-length practice tests as a big part of your prep. This is the exact order. Yeah, it's Chem Phys, then Cars, and Biobalchem, and then Psych. Yeah, this is broken out perfectly. And it's also like little things like, so for example, since the beginning of your exam, which starts at 8 in the morning or earlier, is Chem Phys, it's important for you to be comfortable working through a bunch of physics problems in the early morning. So even in your practice and your prep, to like first thing in the morning, if you're waking up, if you're going to do something on the MCAT, it makes sense to focus on Chem Phys or maybe cars, because those are the morning sections of the exam. And so it's little things like this can make a really big difference in terms of our own like context effects and state dependencies for when we do certain types of studying, to keep in mind. So really like try to make it as real as possible. Same thing when you're basically building up your own study calendar. It's like the best way to build up a study calendar is to effectively give yourself 90-ish minute blocks of study time, where you sit for a straight 90 minutes of working on a thing before you get up and take a break, because that's how long you're going to sit on test day. And if you like in your own system, every half hour you're getting up and doing stuff, it's not going to go well on test day. And so like right now, you don't need to like be sitting for 90 minutes straight, but as you work on this exam and get further and further, you want to push your study blocks into closer and closer and closer to 90-minute sections. These are all kind of like big ideas to kind of like get you towards that 520 plus, is like to make it like the real thing when you practice. Yeah, we'll show you, Maria, in the next page, I think we have a little breakdown of what it looks like. But yeah, the average is basically 500, max is 528, and then lowest would be what, like 473 or 2, I guess, whatever that, yeah, the difference there. But yeah, 500 is average. It's a 125 per section is the average. I think we have a page that's dedicated to that though. All right, so that's the breakdown of timing. In terms of the content, here is a list of content that you see on the MCAT. Notice this doesn't have the cars section, right? Cars section. And also heads up, cars is not reading comp. There is a reason that they don't call the reading section reading comprehension like they do in nearly every other standardized exam. It is different than reading comp. And if you did great in reading comp in your previous standardized exams, like the SAT or ACT, it can help you, but it's not going to be a direct transfer. It is different. It's honestly more challenging. And so like, just to give you like a 2-sentence version of it, where reading comp asks you questions about the passages you read, cars, right, critical analysis and reasoning skills, asks you more about the author, what you can infer about the person who wrote this, and how you can either weaken or strengthen their argument, or how that argument can apply to outside situations. It's less about just like understanding reading. It's more about application and analysis and like extending arguments and stuff like that. So it honestly is harder than reading comp. Many skills in reading comp transfer over, but just be aware, like you got to do more than you do in normal reading comp exams for this. We don't do cars today, but it's just heads up. Like make sure you're doing MCAT specific cars practice, not just reading practice. In terms of the sciences, as you can see, here's a little breakdown. And so one thing, and I mentioned this before, but this is another like very big lesson of the MCAT in general, is that the MCAT exam is super smooshed. And so notice how, even though there is a section that's specifically called biochemical foundations, notice how there's just as much biochemistry in the biochem section as there is in the chem phys section. They do not compartmentalize. And so whenever you're studying anything in your coursework for the next, years, I encourage you to think, when you're learning something like in biochem, think, how does this relate to physics? How does this relate to gen chem? How do these topics intersect? And it's that intersection and connection between the various concepts that will really be your superpower on this exam. Because even if you are not super strong in biochem, if you're great at orgo and chem phys, you can figure out the biochem problems. So it's really huge. Honestly, Addison, I wouldn't stress too much about taking a sociology class before the MCAT. It is a bunch of it's on the MCAT, but you could prep for that just doing straight MCAT prep, honestly. Totally, Ben, for real. Like, I mean, so my least favorite of this exam is the psych soc section. And I was a psych major in my undergrad. I'm like not a huge fan of the psych soc section, except that a big chunk of it is also data interpretation. They will have you read a study and they will have you analyze what those results mean, which is huge. But yeah, it's like, and I mean, you are required to. So the thing is, though, a lot of med schools require you to have psychology and sociology. So it's kind of like, since most med schools are going to require that class anyways, you might as well take it. It's on the MCAT. But like, you don't really need it for the MCAT. Like, it'll help for sure. But exactly as I was saying, like, you could probably do fine if you do all your prep with the MCAT psych soc stuff specifically. Exactly. And agreed. It's like, as I'm saying, like, it really is, of all the sections of the MCAT, I think psych soc is the one that you can very much do on your own, more so than chem phys and biochem, because they're just way more complicated advanced topics where it like helps to have someone talk you through the things. Psychosocial, like honestly, it's about terminology. Like data interpretation is still really important. And honestly, like the reason they add it is they really want culturally aware people who are aware of the differences of outcomes from socioeconomic status on health outcomes and all of the other plethora of things that impacts within society. And so like they want people who are aware of sociological conditions. And that's why it's on the test. But honestly, the way that it often gets tested, while there is some of that, a lot of it's kind of like, do you just remember the names of theories and stuff? And so it's not my favorite section, but there are parts of it that are fantastic, including like the cultural and like, like awareness of, stuff like that. Cool. Yeah, exactly. Anki's pretty good. There's a lot of stuff out there. Yeah. So I'll stop at my psych social, but yeah, it's as a psych major, it's not my favorite section, but it's got some great parts to it at least. Okay, so that was that stuff. In terms of the scores, this is the general breakdown of the scores. As we said, the average is 500. You do not want to apply with a score under 500 no matter where you're applying. Ideally, you want to be having scores that are like 508 plus, effectively. Like that's kind of like what a lot of schools are looking for. But when it comes to the numbers, the only way to really know the numbers that you need, once again, is the MSAR. This is the official resource for allopathic medical schools that will give you all of the numbers. And so definitely check that out. It'll break it all down for you and tell you like what the ranges are, what the averages are, in-state versus out-of-state. If you're a data person, like you will love looking at the data. And if you're not a data person, I encourage you to become one because there's a lot of data interpretation on this exam. So you definitely got to get comfortable with that stuff. Okay, so that's the numbers and the scores. And we had a couple people talking about that stuff in the QA still, but at this point, we will transition for the next while to actually jump into some examples, some problems to like talk about the kind of stuff you do on the MCAT. And we'll kind of do this all as worked examples and give you questions where you can solve them on your own and all that too. But this is an example of a passage that might look like something you'd see on the MCAT. So this is what makes the MCAT so different. It is not a straight content exam. It is a passage-based exam where you are analyzing basically some kind of sciencey study or something like that, and then answering questions about the thing that you read. So generally speaking, like we've all been on PubMed before, I assume, and you've had to like look up papers for studies. And so like in real life, if you're looking up a paper on like PubMed, like you're like white papers, whatever you want to call them, research papers, what do you read? Like if you're gonna like open up some studies and you want to like figure out something, like what are you actually gonna read? Let's be real. Probably just the abstract, Ben, right? Kind of the way that real life works is like we look at a thing, we read the abstract, maybe we'll flip and look at the charts and graphs, but we kind of mostly just look at the abstract and the results. You do not get an abstract on the MCAT. And so like the thing is like we have to work on not just reading something that is logically already broken down for us and telling us what it is. We got to make sense of it on our own. And so this is a really important idea that we need to be practicing. You get a little note, you get a little note board too, right? They give you a little dry, it's a wet erase board on test day with a wet erase marker. It's kind of annoying. Yeah, we'll let teachers cover the other questions for that. But yeah, cool. So let's kind of skim through this. And so whenever you see a passage on the MCAT, what you want to do before you start doing it is you quickly skim through it and just look at it really quickly. And we'll come back to that in a second. And then make a decision. So what decision do you need to make after glancing at this passage? And we can see that there's like some kind of disease, HGPS, there's some kind of mRNA gene stuff going on here. There's some pictures here of some kind of pathway for Nestle group stuff. There's some modifications going on, another little pathway here. Nice, you got it. So the question is, do it or skip it. Why might you skip something? Yeah, that's perfect, Mary. You got it. That's very much what we want to. When we get to the question, that's what we'll do. But before we even read the questions, you got it. Because the thing is, every single question on the MCAT is worth exactly 1 point. It doesn't matter if it's easy or hard. And so if you have a passage that is an exceptionally difficult passage, your best thing to do is to skip it and do it at the very end. That way, if you do struggle with timing and run out of time, at least you're going to be short on time on a super hard passage that you might have gotten a bunch of stuff wrong anyways. And so people who've done some MCAT practice before, have you done this where you actually like look at because when you take a practice exam, it'll tell you how long you spend on passages. Has anyone noticed before that the passage they spend the most time on, they also do the worst on? Is anyone willing to admit that this is a thing you've noticed before? It's like almost everybody that's true. I know a lot of folks haven't actually taken practice exams and looked at the data yet, but this is really true for a lot of people. And so what that tells you is that if you get a really hard passage, don't sink a bunch of time into it. It's probably not going to translate to a bunch of extra points. Instead, put the time into the passages that are easier that you could do correctly and feel confident on, and then come back to these harder ones and work through them relatively quickly. So now this is another part of like folks who are looking for really high scores, the 520 crew, is that even if you're going to get a super high score, you can do that by still rushing through a passage or two. Most people struggle with timing, at least in the cars section, and even really high scorers often will have to like go faster than they would like on a passage. So what's going to be really important is not only are you good at identifying the hardest passage that you're probably going to get a lot of stuff wrong anyways, but working through difficult passages in a short period of time to get really good at guessing. And so we're going to talk about some of those ideas today as well, that like if you have that hard passage, even high scorers find themselves guessing. How do you guess really well to make sure that even though you spent 5 minutes on the thing, you can still get more than half of them right? That's a huge skill that's important for this test. Okay, so for this, we're not going to rush. We'll like read it for real and talk about it. But so in Kaplan courses, we talk about a lot of different strategies that apply in a lot of different situations. I'm not going to get into all the different strategies today, but the one that I want to introduce today is a thing that we call outlining. And so what outlining means is as you read a passage, to just very briefly jot down a note or two for each paragraph. Why? Like, what's the benefit of this? Like, why might you jot down a note or two after you finish every paragraph? There's like 2 great benefits. So to reference in the future, right? So once you're doing the problems, it's nice to have those quick notes for your own organization, right? To get back to it. But there's another reason too, right? So you don't have to reread, so you have to read the paragraph, agreed, but there's another thing too. It's true, it does help save time in the end. So think about the act. If you read a paragraph and you stop and think, okay, what is this about? And then try to write down a couple words. Exactly, Aiden. It's going to force you to actually stop and comprehend what you just read before you jump into reading more complicated jargon. Because often when people read really complicated stuff and they keep moving and reading more complicated stuff, they're not going to remember anything at the beginning of the passage because you're just kind of like drinking from the fire hose and you can't swallow anything. So giving yourself that moment to just take a step back and be like, oh, this is a paragraph about that. Move on. It really helps comprehension, as well as we're saying to let you reference in the future, hit the main points, saves times in the long run. So I love outlining. It's not the best strategy for every passage. We have different strategies for different types, but it's a pretty good all-around strategy for lots of folks. It's good for this one for a specific reason. Now, the reason that I think this one would be very good to outline from doing a quick preview is at the beginning, we notice that we're talking about some kind of rare genetic disease. And then we talk about the disease results from, we see things like mutations and a bunch of like sciencey words there. Then you glance at the next paragraph, notice that we have a 2 things. We have notice we have this thing here where this whole chunk of paragraph is likely describing this figure since it's kind of like surrounding the figure. And notice that this figure talks about mutant something something. This is probably a whole thing about how things go wrong. If we look at the next paragraph, notice it starts with normal processing. It also says normal at the bottom as well. So this whole paragraph here must just be like the normal processing. So even though we haven't read this, we can kind of already anticipate what we're going to be writing down. Like this is probably normal stuff. This is probably mutant stuff. This is probably introducing a disease. Without even reading, we can infer that. And this is going to be a really important part of your MCAT prep as well, is not just reading stuff carefully, but how do you like preview something quickly and make sense of what you're going to be looking at? Because if you can anticipate what you're going to see, it makes it so much easier to keep up with the jargon when you get to it. No, we will, Maria. This is like, so that total thing we just did is like 10 seconds or less. You glance, like, okay, I see what I'm doing here. Then you start reading. But how long are we going to spend reading this probably? Once we actually start reading everyone? Like, what do you think? Yeah, probably like maybe 3, maybe 4 minutes. Not a lot. So we get on average about 8 to 10 minutes per passage, depending on the section. Majority of that time, though, is going to be sent towards the questions, not the reading. And so this is another thing that makes the MCAT so much different. While it's passage-based, while we're going to read this thing, we're not actually going to read to try to understand every detail. That takes way too long. We read to get the gist of what's talking about. We read to find where the information is. And then when the questions come up, we're going to know where to go back to look at it. But you're not going to actually fully read to comprehend everything unless you're just really, if it's a background content area, if you're a really fast reader, maybe. But for most folks, like we kind of like just read to get the gist and know where stuff is, not actually fully comprehend. So, but once again, if you're really good or it's a topic, heck yeah, read to understand. That's great. Okay, so let's do that. Yeah, basically, if you got it, that is the idea. Which makes sense because it's a science exam, right? They want you to develop those skills because that's the same thing you're doing in med school when you're doing research, right? Actually, Delaney, that's a great question. Not for the MCAT. So for the previous exams, right? So I know that's a great strategy people talk about for like SAT and some other exams. I do not recommend looking at the questions before the passage for the MCAT. largely because this test is just too hard. Like simply knowing what the question is going to ask about doesn't necessarily mean you're just going to find it in the passage directly. And that trying to multitask by remembering the questions while you read ends up like, I know people think that they're great at multitasking, but most people aren't. And when you start multitasking, our efficiency goes down in both of them. So it's better to just do one thing at a time and really focus on just the passage or focus on the questions. So yeah, Delaney, for the MCAT, I don't recommend it. Some people probably do, but like only if you're like a real rock star multitasker. For most folks, it ends up going in the opposite direction. Okay, so let's read the first paragraph. What stands out? You don't need to understand everything, but like thematically, what's this first paragraph about? And this is, you can note this down. So yeah, we've got this disease, this HGPS. You can jot that down. And then what about it? It's honestly, symptoms. Yeah, so it's a bunch of symptoms. The symptoms. Cool. Don't stress about the whole like teenage years, 20s, loss of hair. Who cares? It's a rare genetic disease and it sounds bad. There's a bunch of symptoms. Cool. Move on. How about paragraph 2? That's like the extent that we want to focus when we read. Oh, now we're getting some like very testable things. We have a point mutation. Perfect. What's a point mutation mean? It's a replacement. Perfect. And they do tell you specifically that a cytosine is replaced with a thymine. I might actually jot that down because that sounds like a very testable detail, right? So paragraph 2, we have a mutation, which is basically a C's changed to a T. What else? And that results in it tells you right away, a shortened mRNA transcript, right? So basically that gives you short mRNA. So mutate C, I'll just write short mRNA. The codes for a faulty version of unprocessed. I'm not sure what that's saying, so we'll kind of keep skimming. Anything else kind of show up here? Yeah, it eventually results in, what do you call this? Mutant prelamin A, right? It's an unprocessed version. So it's kind of like, you might skim through the details because it says figure 1 here. So I bet all the details are shown in figure 1. And we can kind of just jump right to the end here that says it's basically mutant prelamin A. Sorry, I realized I should just be typing because I typed before. I'll be consistent with my nomenclature here. But so short mRNA, and then we'll just call it mute prelamin A. So notice I'm doing lots of abbreviations here. You're not writing out a full summary. I'm skipping a bunch of steps. I'm kind of just talking about the first thing and the last thing, right? C to T, short mRNA, and then you get a bunch of problems that eventually result in this mutant protein. Cool. How do I know it's a protein? Couple things, because we're starting with mRNA, post-translational processing, and the fact that it's called prelam-in. Notice words that often end in in. What are some other sciencey words that end in in? Essential dogma stuff, right? Protein, right? In as well. Insulin, actin, myosin. These are all made of what? Prolactin, same thing. Immunoglobulin, love it. They're all made of amino acids, right? Some of those were hormones, some of those were proteins, but whether it's a protein or a hormone, they're still made of the same building blocks of amino acids. You got it. Yeah, so what you do here, you can't write it on the screen. They give you this like wet erase board. It's like this yellow laminated booklet that you can flip over the top with a wet erase marker. And so this is the kind of stuff you would jot down in that little wet erase booklet in terms of like, paragraph 1, paragraph 2. Yeah, but that's, so heads up also, it is not a pen and paper. It's a wet erase marker, which is really annoying to work with. And so when you're doing your practice, I encourage you to get an actual test booklet. They come with all the Kaplan courses. You could buy them on the internet too. But it's like, it's honestly annoying. It'd be nice if they let you use pen and paper, but they don't. Cool. Yeah, you can also highlight as well. I'm just like, we're going to do outlining because that's what we're going to do. But yeah, you could also highlight this instead. It's like you can't erase it with a marker. You have to actually wash it in the sink to clear it off. It's so that the thing is like, since you can't erase it yourself, when you're done, you give it to the test makers. They clean it with like Lysol wipes kind of thing and give you a fresh one. It's like a booklet. You got it. But it's like, I think it's annoying that it's wet erase. It's a pain. Like even if you buy your own, when you clean it, it makes a mess everywhere because you can't just wipe it off with dry paper towel. You need to get like an actual like wet wipe to do it. Yeah, exactly. It makes it a mess, as Nick says. It's so true. Okay, so warning, if you get those things, make sure you clean it in a place that you can get dirty because it's going to make it filthy. All right, we'll move on to there. So now what stands out here? What would you outline for this? So we're still continuing. So what you could probably do for this paragraph 3 is we're still continuing at the previous paragraph. So I might do an arrow up just to reference previous paragraph continued. And then effectively there's, we have this for a nested group gets locked, no support for the nuclear envelope. And yeah, so basically nuclear envelope, I might do like a frowny face gets messed up, and then mitosis gets messed up. And you can do this in your notes. You can just write frowny face because there's a problem with this. There's a problem with this. The whole point of outlining is to write as few notes as possible that just make sense to you. Cool. Oh, it's just that it ends in IN, so it means a protein, Christian. Yeah, so things that end in IN, it's a shortcut that it's a protein. It's made of amino acids. That's true for insulin, somatostatin as well, even if it's a hormone. It's a peptide hormone. Cool. So then we see this thing here, and this is our mutant prelamin. So notice you start off with your deletion, and then it looks like you have this FTAs, which adds this little group here. And then I'm not sure what happens. You have some kind of a cleavage, and then something gets methylated, and basically we get this mutant thing. So I would not stress too much about the details here. If we get questions, we'll come back and look at it. But this is effectively showing you the pathway of when the thing is broken. All right. So then the final paragraph, notice it tells you right off the bat that it is normal processing. And so that alone is probably going to be enough. So paragraph 4, this is normal processing. What seems to be a difference? Needing. Cool. Yeah, so we farnesylate a cysteine. That might, if you were highlighting, that might be a good thing to highlight the cysteine and 3 aliphatic amino acids there, because like it's a very easy thing for them to test. But also if you have a question on normal processing, we can find that. Anything else? So I think the amino acids are testable there. Anything else stand out as testable that's not already shown here? So we've got the same pathways, right? Farnesylation, cleavage, methylation. The difference, if you want, you can kind of analyze the differences between these two. But notice how in the previous one, it looks like, sorry, the big difference is we have this mutant thing. Notice there's one more step after methylation. They have a cleavage. So it looks like the main difference here is that you chop off the end of the thing. In the previous one, we ended after this step. So they add one more step in the pathway where you chop something off. But for the outline, you could probably just write normal processing. But I think there is another thing that's kind of interesting that pops up here, almost as an afterthought. Seems testable. Most of these details are all shown here, so I wouldn't stress about the details that are also shown in the diagram. It is that's all testable. Yeah, so the cysteine 3 aliphatic amino acids. I might throw a highlight on that, honestly, because they love testing individual amino acids for sure. But also notice at the very end here, these FTAs inhibitors have been tested and shown to reverse the malformation. That's just thrown in at the after effect. They don't explain why. Do you know what they often do if they throw in an extra detail and don't explain why? Good chance they're going to basically ask you about it, make you reason why. Totally true. And so, yeah, something about the main thing you'd need to note here is like, oh, FTase inhibitors, how does this relate? And notice that it is the first enzyme in that pathway. So effectively inhibiting that first step seems to reverse the malformation of the nuclear envelope. Doesn't say it cures the disease, but it reverses this malformation. And they'll probably ask a question about it. Okay, let's do the questions. So for the questions here, I'm going to bring up a poll and let you all actually answer these on your own. So generally speaking, when it comes to MCAT, as you said before, don't just do the passages in order. That's the most important. Skip hard passages, save them for the end. But even when it comes to individual questions, if you have a hard question and you struggle with the passage, feel free to skip it and do it later on. And so say why question, it's relatively open-ended. But since we just read about the FTase inhibitors, I might just do it right now since it's something we just read. But generally speaking, open-ended, tougher questions people will often skip. And so let's give folks a chance to solve this thing. A poll is going to appear momentarily. Oops, not that one. Sorry, wrong poll. Polls. Nope, not that poll. Answer is, there we go. This one should work. All right, feel free to vote in that poll as soon as you have an answer. And then for this one, I'll kind of talk through the process as well. So the question, giving you the full strategy, we call this the trim method. Type, rephrase, investigate, match. Typing means decide whether you're going to do it or skip it. I'd probably do this one since we just read about it, and then glance at the answer choices. It's all logical things about FTAs inhibitors or Rogerin or pre-Lamin stuff. So not too much we get from the answers. So rephrasing is just going to figure out why this nuclear envelope problem is reversed with these FTAs inhibitors. So to solve this, we probably want to honestly go back to the passage to see what the deal with FTAs inhibitors were. So it was talked about right here. And notice we said FTAs inhibitors. It's not that it's a cure, but it reverses the malformation. And so if you want, you can figure out why is there a malformation happening in the first place and be like, okay, well, why is there a malformation? Go back to the previous one here, and it looks like this is where we talk about it says that the farnesyl group locks progerin into the nuclear rim, and that's what causes the malformation of the nuclear envelope. So it's this farnesyl group, it's this thing here, is getting stuck to the nuclear rim, and that's basically screwing things up. So effectively, if we then inhibit this step, then we're never going to add that group. So there's nothing to really get stuck to the nuclear envelope. So look for something that basically says that. So sorry, I realize the spacing's a little weird here, but you can tell how D's just moved up one space, but you can tell that D's the bottom line there. All right, so we have, if you haven't voted yet, please go for it. We have two common answers here. So I'll just draw some arrows in case if you're torn. The two most popular answers we have are B and D. Cool. So I'm going to go for D first because we have majority of the room is going for answer choice D. So this is all just to show you the breakdown of the results right now. It's the most popular answer. But so now to break it down, it says FTAs inhibitors physically prevent progerin from locking to the nuclear rim. So that would make sense. It would make the nuclear rim not misfolded if it stopped progerin from locking to it. But you got to make sure that the answer choice isn't something that would justify getting fixed, but that it actually makes sense according to the passage. So when you call something like an FTAs inhibitor, what does that mean? Like using your outside enzyme and inhibition context. What would an FTAs inhibitor do? If it's a something A's inhibitor, that means that it's a stopper of what? Could be competitive, but it's an inhibitor of an enzyme, right? We don't know if it's necessarily competitive or non-competitive or uncompetitive or what it is, but we know for sure that it's going to inhibit this enzyme. It's not like it's going to get in the way and block something. It's just going to stop a process from happening. And if you stop the very first process in an entire pathway, what happens to the rest of the pathway? Or any of those kind of synthetic pathway, the rest doesn't happen either. If you stop step one, nothing else occurs. You're shutting down the whole process by stopping step one. So it's not that you're physically stopping it from forming, right? Because the whole thing is if you stop this process, you're not making pre-lamin. You're not making the thing at all. And so it's not that you're physically blocking it. It's just that you are not making the thing, which is what the second most popular answer was with answer choice B. Just no progerin's gonna be made at all if you inhibit the first step in the process. So we're not saying it's a cure for the disease. You're gonna be missing this protein, but at least now you aren't making something that gets stuck to your nuclear envelope and screws everything up. Cool. So this is an important lesson when it comes to the MCAT in general. You have to make sure that the answer choice you're choosing doesn't just justify why the thing could work, but that it also relates to the passage and the question stem. So this is the most common trap you're going to see for wrong answers is things that are true according to the passage, but don't match the question, or vice versa. Like this one, it matches the question, it justifies something not getting messed up, but it doesn't actually fit the passage with what we're talking about. Like inhibitors don't actually physically block stuff. They stop an enzyme from building a thing, not from things binding to each other. At least if it's an FTAs, right? Because A's means enzyme, so it's an enzyme inhibitor. Okay, let's do the next one. So number two, this one I think we would definitely do. What do you notice when you glance at the answer choices? They're all different amino acids. You got it. So they're all different amino acids. And 3 are nonpolar. It's a good point, Kristen, as well. So let's do this. I'll bring up the poll. All different R groups. Go for it. It's the carboxy terminus of prelamin A. So to solve this, a couple ways you could do this. We could go back to the passage and see where did we talk about the carboxy terminus of prelamin A. And we have it right here. So what's the word that we need here? We'll go back to second right, Frank. So it is either, as we said, we actually highlighted this before, that it is either cysteine or 3 aliphatic amino acids. Perfect. So we look for the answer choices and see, do we have cysteine, first of all? Don't see cysteine. So it must be the aliphatic. So what does aliphatic mean? Non-aromatic and non-polar. Totally true. Perfect. Cool. You got it. So both non-aromatic and non-polar. So which of these are non-aromatic and non-polar? Just alanine. You got it. So now the cool thing is there's actually another way that you could solve this question without even going back using the answer structures to your advantage. So what do you notice about the first 3? Tyrosine, tryptophan, phenylalanine. They are all aromatic. So this is another thing to keep in mind when you are prepping for the MCAT, is that often you don't need to necessarily know the right answer if you can use the answer choices to your advantage. If 3 things all say the same thing, then they're probably all going to be wrong. Like Max says, it's the which one of these things is not like the other. D is the one that's different than the other 3, and it's got to be the right answer. Cool. But for real, it's like that's a real thing you see all the time. Like if you see 2 answer choices saying the same thing, they both must be wrong. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move back to the rest of, we're going to, oops, sorry, I apologize. That's the wrong button. One sec. Share screen. There we go. Sorry about that. There we go. All right. So to move on past this passage, we're actually going to jump ahead. I want to talk a little bit more about the theory that we started at the very beginning of class when we talked a lot about just like MCAT prep in general and resources. I know we did a lot of that at the very beginning. I want to jump back to that for the last portion of this. So remember, there's a giveaway going on. If you don't mind actually throwing that back into the chat again, Nick, I know you did this previously. But just we'll put the link back up. There's a thing for tuition going on. We sadly are not qualified to enter the giveaway as Kaplan employees, sadly. So I weren't able to fill out the form. But you all are, so I encourage you to do it. And so nice, Nick's got the handout for you. So the last things I want to talk about though, it's so I realized, Maria, I had the timing wrong. I thought it was a 75-minute. It's actually said 60. So we're gonna go a little bit over because I thought this was longer than it actually is, but I'm just gonna keep rolling with it if that's cool with you all. And so the thing is, let's talk a little bit more what we did in the very beginning when it comes to maximizing study plans. And so a couple of things, just big picture. If you are going into this fresh, I strongly encourage you to first, when it comes to like studying and practicing, start with the materials that are foundational building blocks for more advanced things. We said this at the very beginning, right? Knowing your word roots, knowing the units within physics, knowing your periodic table trends. And so like the problem is a lot of people will prep for the MCAT and think, oh man, I don't know optics. So they'll jump into optics. Optics is great. You need to know it for the MCAT. It's an important idea, but nothing else is really built on it beyond optics itself. Whereas things like periodic table trends, that's the entirety of Gen Chem, acid-base chemistry, biochemistry, organic chemistry. It's the foundational things that you really want to start with. And so one of the cool things in terms of how we build our courses is that we basically build them in a way that progressively builds mastery and naturally does that. You can do it on your own. It's just way easier to have someone else design the program for you. And so it's basically what we do for Kaplan. I myself was a Kaplan student way back in the day. It's like it's unless it yeah, it just makes it easier to like be told what you need to do and when to do it effectively. And so it's also based in this thing where it's basically instructional order. We call this spaced repetition. Talked about this in the beginning as well. But the idea is that when you get exposed to a thing, it's important to get exposed to it again in terms of a review and practice soon after, and then once again. So to have something exposed multiple times, you're more likely to retain it long term than if you study it once and then don't see it again for a month. It's kind of like naturally built into the order of the course. All right, so this is the way we do things. What we call it is first pass. And so the idea is in the very beginning of your prep, you're going to focus mostly on content refreshment, right? You're going to work through a lot of studying. You're going to review stuff you didn't know. You're still going to do some practice problems, but it's going to be predominantly themed in terms of a content review, watching videos, reading books, that kind of stuff. As you get into it, that focus turns into more application, where there's still videos to watch, but more so if you get things wrong and you're struggling with it. A lot of it's going to be presented as a quiz, and the quiz tells you what you need to do to work on. The third pass, we call this prep cycle, is very much letting full-length exams and other AAMC passages tell you what you need to work on. And so it's not just like, I'm going to study physics today. It's you open up an AAMC resource, you work through a bunch of passages, and you let it tell you what you need to work on. So that's really, really huge. And so this is like the nature of how we set up the course. And even if you're not doing a course, like this is an important format to set to your studying to kind of like work towards it where the end, like all you're really doing is largely full-length exams and other passageways problems. And so it all breaks into a calendar. One thing I want to bring up too, this is like one of my favorite things about our courses. I was a Catholic student too, is that we offer, these are new. So I wish this was around when I was studying way back in the 15 years ago. But the idea is that in the evenings, we offer a bunch of additional workshops that are content-specific sections. So these are things that any student can basically opt into, like assuming you're in a normal course, you can opt into and basically go if you need the content. There's other classes that are basically your core class that you go to that are based on, like the main things that you're studying, and it has required assignments and homework to do between as well. But there's also additional workshops that you can jump into depending on your own strengths and weaknesses and what you need to do. So it's a super cool study plan. All right, so then in terms of, we've covered this a lot as well. This is the idea of the prep cycle. I encourage all of you to effectively start by taking a full-length exam. And so it's good at the beginning. And this is like not if you're like a freshman, sophomore now, right? But when you start, you're like, okay, I'm testing in 3 to 6 months. I'm gonna get ready for this thing. Start with a full-length exam to identify the stuff you need to work on. That's gonna give you a big leg up for what kind of content you need to refresh on. Once you do that, you basically start working through the content, find the things that are foundational, take another full-length exam, and from that, you transition towards largely practicing till eventually at the end, you're doing what we call a prep cycle, which is effectively full-length exam, review it, learn from your mistakes, and then keep going forward like that. Rana, great question. So the on-demand is basically, there's no live classes like this. It's all recorded videos. I'm a huge fan of the not the on-demand, but like the live online ones or the in-person classes, just because then you can like drop into all of these like live streaming classes, ask questions in real time. We offer them like, especially in the winter break times, there's like 5 a day, 6 days a week, maybe not always 5 days, but there's a ton of classes going on all the time. Yeah, we actually have an Ask a Teacher. Do you want to put up the little you can book me thing, Nick, if you don't mind? So we have a couple but yeah, for the on-demand, it's mostly through like kind of like email things, but for all the live stuff, you have like live teachers that you work with multiple times a week where you can ask questions all the time. It's awesome. So I'm a big fan of it. It's what I teach. I do tons of them. But you can also do email support kind of regardless. There's like an email account where we manage things. That's kind of like a co-team thing. Cool. That's the idea. And so the nice thing about the structure is if you have something you already have down, like I'm assuming all of you are busy. Like if you're pre-med, you're probably busy. Like all the volunteer work, those classes, right? The research you're probably doing, volunteering, etc. And so the thing is like you don't want to put a bunch of time into stuff that you don't need to study. And so the whole idea of having the schedule set up such with the placement quiz is if you do well on a topic, you can move quicker and save your time. Whereas if you do more poorly on a topic, it's going to suggest more problems for you to do in that content area. It's also all organized according to what we call yield. So the idea is that the higher yield things, right, things that show up in the MCAT more are given higher priority than things that can be on the MCAT, but don't statistically show up all of the time. It's the general idea. And so when I kept saying prep cycle, this is the idea, is you take a practice test, you review your results to learn from them, you then practice them in additional resources before you take your next practice exam. This is the most important thing. You don't just take a practice test, see what your score is, and then take the next one. You have to review your mistakes, identify what those weaknesses are, learn from those mistakes, and then practice them. And so one of the big things that are really important to do here are the AAMC question packs. all come with Kaplan classes, but you can buy them independently from the AMC as well as the AAMC section banks. So these are two of the most important ways to basically practice additional problems in the same content areas that are not in the context of a full-length exam itself. Correcting it, yeah. Honestly, I think it's good to review every single question on the exam, including all of the wrong answers for each problem as well, to make sure you can justify why the wrong answers are wrong and why the right answers are right. But yeah, as Mike says, for real. I actually don't know too much about UWorld. I've heard it's tough, like they do hard questions, but I actually don't know enough about it, Samuel. Honestly, though, questions are questions. Like no matter what, you got to get the AMC questions, but that alone is almost never enough for people. And so I would recommend, I mean, Kaplan, I teach for Kaplan, I did a course, I think it's the best, but UWorld's also a resource for questions. There's the Khan Academy questions, there's tons of stuff out there, but you got to make sure you have an AMC no matter what. And I would also have like additional questions through like companies are nice. And that's kind of like the nice thing. Kaplan has so many questions, and I'll show you like some of the things that I like about it, like why I did it when I was studying back in the day. It's so Kristen, I wouldn't worry too much about it because the assessment quizzes, they give you so many questions that it's not going to be like if you guess right on a single question, it's still going to be probably other ones are wrong. So yeah, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, I think it would get caught. I wouldn't worry about it, Kristen, for real. There's just so many questions and they get covered in so many contexts. And so this is what I was saying about like reviewing and doing topical workshops and studying your mistakes and all that stuff. All right, so last thing, I'll talk about a couple of the problems that we have. And so basically there are, I think, a total of 5 AMC exams. Do you all know about how many full-length exams you want to take before you sit for the real thing? This is for the average person who does well enough to apply to medical schools. It's about 10, yeah, about 8 to 10 is the average. So you don't have enough with the AMC. You need to get additional practice tests. Kaplan has 13 of them. I'm sure UWorld has some. I'm sure there's other ones out there as well. But like, it is and so yeah, it's like you need more than just the AMC stuff, but the AMC stuff is the most important. They're the ones who make the actual MCAT. It's why we give it with every course. It's essential. And a lot of people, Jake, I actually do recommend doing the first AMC exam. So the AMC 1 is the oldest one. So like that one I think is fine to use at the very beginning. We actually recommend that for the first one for people to take. But then after that, you kind of save the other AMC exams for a little bit later. You want to, like what I would recommend for your later prep is to save all those other AMC exams for the end. And you want to work in those AMC question packs and section banks and question packs as well. But there's so many AMC resources that people don't actually get to that all come with the course. I'd recommend doing 100% of the AMC problems for real. And you get another, I'm not sure what the book exams, actually, if you want to, if the book is, so Marie, we have, I know with the course itself, there's 13. I know that if you buy the books have certain access as well. I don't actually know how that works. Like I only work on the side where we do the full courses and classes and things. But there is a thing out there with the books that I just don't know. I'll see if the other teachers know that one. But yeah, so kind of like the idea is like build a schedule. In terms of scheduling that I'd recommend you all to do is to start building a schedule way out. Like pick a test date that you want to work on. And then with that, work backwards from there where you give yourself effectively one full-length exam every week for the month or so before the exam. Then after that, you can make it you can do it every week for months if you want, or do every other week before that. But you want to kind of schedule out a time where you have a test date, you have at least a month of full-length exams once a week before that, and then make sure you go back far enough to make it a total of 8 to 10 full-length exams that you schedule in. Once you have that set up, it kind of gives you the larger structure of what the full-length exam schedule looks like. And remember, you're not going to start off by doing a ton of full-length exams. You start your prep by doing one exam and then months of review and studying stuff and practicing individual problems before you get into this like doing exams all the time. But it's this doing exams all the time is really the crunch time where it's like you want to make sure that you can get a little bit of a lighter load in terms of class or work or school. You do an exam, that's it. So about 1 week before your MCAT, do a full-length exam. See how it goes. If it is not something you'd be comfortable applying with, I would change your test date, John. I think you might need to change it. I think it's around 7 days is the cutoff. It might be like a little more than that to actually change your test date. When you register for the MCAT, it'll give you these zones. It's like gold zone, silver zone, bronze zone. It tells you like what the cost is and when you're able to change your dates and all that stuff. So the week before, it's 10 days. Yeah. So actually 10 days before is your cutoff, Nikki. So if you want to do your final exam to like analyze that, 10 days is the day. But in terms of the week before your MCAT, honestly, Sean, I recommend doing a bunch of practice problems on the things that you enjoy. The thing is a lot of people spend so much of their time prepping for the MCAT doing problems on their weaknesses and the stuff that they are terrible at and they don't like, that they forget to do the things on the things they actually like the physiology, maybe the gen chem, that kind of stuff. And so it's doing more practice problems on that, because often if we haven't seen something for a while, we're more prone to make silly mistakes. Perfect. I don't even, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, exactly. So like the week before your real exam is what you mean, right? Is yeah, honestly working on, yeah, lots of practice problems for things you enjoy. Totally. And that's before your actual MCAT, like the real exam, totally. Yeah, Kate, we have recordings for all these things. I think they get mailed out for whatever email address you registered with, get sent to your email. You got it. So that's the idea. Really, like, it's not just like the test. You got the books. It's also like we have this thing called a Q bank. So one of the really useful things is like when you're getting further into the course and you realize that there's only specific subjects, things like having a Q bank are very useful because you can design a quiz based solely on the stuff that you want to cover. So there's 17 full-length practice exams. That includes the AMC stuff, as well as all the other AMC resources as well. Perfect. Perfect. Great, great. All right. So that's kind of all that stuff. We've covered most of the things. If you are interested, I'm actually teaching a live class in Boulder, Colorado this upcoming January, February, March cycle. It's a Saturday, Sunday class. So if you happen to live in Colorado and want to do a class with me in person, I'll be doing a class in Boulder weekends kind of thing. We cover the schedule. Pretty much like all the things we make were made by top scorers. I think all the teachers that teach the online, live online classes now are 520 plus scores themselves. Ari is a dear friend of mine, of course, had a rock star score because Gary's a rock star. But there's also tutoring, there's admissions consulting, there's boot camp. Actually, if you're into boot camp, there's another thing we do every winter and summer, but it's a 5-week intensive where it is a very hardcore compressed MCAT schedule. This is often scheduled around people who want to test in January. So those of you that have a very available time to do nothing but MCAT from mid-December to mid-January, boot camp is a super good option. Ari and I teach there together. Nick and Mike do sometimes we do that, right? But I think it's not, yeah, it's a thing. But yeah. Oh, and check it out. There's a promo code. It is 520 NOV. That's right there on the screen. Also, Nick put in the chat. There's a little series of the upcoming classes. Those are live online classes that run. And if you want to hang out in Boulder, Colorado, I'll be teaching in January, starting Saturday, Sunday classes there as well. And Mike is teaching in person in Madison, Wisconsin. And then I teach a lot of online stuff too in the workshops in the evenings and stuff like that too. But yeah, thanks for coming in out, everybody. Thanks for sticking a little bit after. Let us know if you have any questions. As always, we will hang out for a bit. But keep coming to these things. We do them all the time. You will get the recording of this sent to your email box, whatever you register for the course. And if you want to register for that scholarship, as Nick says, it is right there. Perfect. There's ways to do like a la carte where you get just full-length exams, Marie. I'm not quite sure how that works. I might just go to captest.com and reach out. There's like a live chat option. You can just be like, hey, what's the deal with these? And they'll like know all that stuff. Most of the stuff that we all deal with is kind of like the ones where it's like the course and then stuff that comes with the course, but not like the kind of books and just the exam stuff. But yeah, you're very welcome. I mostly wanted to make sure everyone knows what they're getting themselves into. It is a huge commitment. It's a big test, but also the thing about the MCAT that makes it awesome is it makes you synthesize all the crap that you've learned in undergrad, tie it together, and see why you've been focusing on it and why you learn it. It usually kind of like helps people actually appreciate the science, which is really important for going to med school. So yeah, go for it. All right, you're very welcome, everyone. All right, so we'll close down the room in the next couple minutes. Other than that, it's been great work with you. Keep up the good work. And remember, don't just study, make sure you're practicing. All right, take care, everybody. There is, yeah, Stacy, there's payment plans. There's also tuition assistance. I would reach out to the, if you go to the live chat option, basically, you can reach out. There's tuition assistance. It does normal FAFSA forms. We basically actually get like a discount for that. It's basically need-based scholarship stuff, normal FAFSA stuff. And then there's also monthly payment plans and all that stuff too. But yeah, check out, if you go to the live chat, it has it all there. There's also do you want to put the You Can Book Me link up there? Oh, thank you. There's the tuition assistance. And then there's like we also have this thing where it's perfect. There we go. You Can Book Me that Nick just put up. If you click on that, that'll actually take you directly to a teacher who basically you're like, hey, this is what's going on. This is what I'm thinking. You can schedule a session and people let you know. Perfect. Cool. Excellent. Sure thing. And I know if you got to bounce too, I know when the teacher has to go, so feel free to take off. Yeah, and then on demand it's basically you get access to all the same exams and all the same resources, but it's just videos. So that's the thing with on demand. It's basically just not live streaming classes. It's just the recordings. And so we have recordings of all the classes. It's just not like these kinds of things where they're live, other than like the free ones that we do. Cool. Yeah, I mean, like it's up to you, Sean. In terms of like your actual MCAT exam, I would, at this point, I wouldn't put in details. It's really just scheduling in like when your full length exam is going to be. But I would make sure that if you're taking an actual like course, I would make sure the course is done like up to a month, maybe not a month, but like several weeks at least before your actual test date. So you have several weeks to a month or more of time to really crank it just to practice problems. Perfect. Oh, no worries. You're good, Nora. But yeah, and like, so it's really with like the building out a schedule that far in the future, it's really just scheduling in when you take your full length exams. And I would take your last full length exam no sooner than a week before the real thing. Like you don't want to be taking full length exams like a couple of days before the real thing. It's just too stressful. It's not worth it. So yeah, cool. All right. Well, that's it. We might close it down. But it's been great hanging out with everybody. Hit us up if you have any questions. Um, the day before, Sean, for sure. The day before that, you can crank still. It's just like, you know what I mean? Like what you probably end up doing though is like I wouldn't like schedule out the things you're gonna be doing, but I would probably definitely work 2 days before your MCAT still. So do practice problems, do some review. But yeah, the day before your MCAT, you want to chill. Try that you could book me. Let me actually check real quick, Rada. I'll make sure that I have the correct link for that. But yeah, we have teachers that basically do a thing where they are. Where is the you can book me? Or we have it around here somewhere. Um, Here it is. Oh, I think the way that was correct. It's I'll put yeah, there we go. Perfect. Thank you. Max got there. But yeah, so if you click on that one, Rana, it'll basically you can make an appointment with somebody, be like, this is what's going on. This is my test date. These are all the ideas, and then someone can work through it with you. So that's the link. Cool. Thanks for grabbing that, Mike. I was like looking through our forms. I was like, I can find it somewhere here, but Mike's a step ahead of me, as always. You're always a step ahead of me. Okay, well, I'll close down the room, but it's been great working with you all. Check out the You Can Book Me link. Save that. You're very welcome, Peter. All right. Have a good rest of your weekends, everyone else, and we'll see you in the future.